Hi everyone, it's James here, and in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to set up remote debugging in Visual Studio Code. So we'll be setting some breakpoints in our source files and then pausing the execution of the running code in the browser. So this will enable you to actually inspect everything that's going on within your code in Visual Studio Code and examine the variables and dig into other parts of the code to see actually what's going on if you've got a problem. So we'll be looking at 3 examples. The first will be really simple, then we'll look at a more complex example, and then we'll look at how you might use this to actually debug a React application. So keep watching till the end of the video to see how that works, but right now let's dive into a simple example of debugging your code with Visual Studio Code.
Okay, so we're going to look at some ways of debugging our JavaScript code directly within Visual Studio Code, and we're going to look at a really simple example first just to get you used to it, and keep watching to the end so that you see how we do that with a React example as well. Okay, so I've got a really simple project here, and it's basically just got this really simple bit of JavaScript code, which when I click the button, you see in the console we get the numbers logging out, where we're keeping track of this value of I. So we might have a need to debug this code and work out what the value of I is or what's happening to it. And you may already know or have seen from a previous tutorial that if we go to the sources tab here in Chrome and then select the index.js file, we can actually put what we call a breakpoint at any point in our code. And then when we actually trigger that code, for example by clicking the button, the execution of the code actually pauses and we can have a look in here and see what all of these values are, such as the value that's stored in I. And this is fine for a simple example, but when your code gets a bit more complicated, you'll probably find that process a little bit harder to do. So this is where it's really useful to get set up with Visual Studio Code. Okay, so we've got the ability here to actually put a breakpoint in the code, pretty much in the same way that we did in the browser. But if we just keep clicking the button, you see that the execution of the code doesn't actually pause, and you can see that the number is still incrementing. Okay, so there is a debugging section over here in Visual Studio Code, and if you look at it at the moment, you can see there's no options for us to actually run the debugger from here. And you'll see how this looks when we've got a configuration set up. But as you can see here, the message is telling us to create a launch.json file. So we can actually click that button here, and what it will do is take us over to a special file which may or may not be present in your project already, but if it's not there, it'll be created for you. But essentially we've got this .vscode folder, and in there's a couple of files, including this launch.json. So in here, we're actually going to put in some configuration to link the VS Code instance that we've got here to the application that we've got running. So in the array for configurations here, we just create a new JSON object and we fill in a few properties. The first is a name, and this is going to be the name that's going to be appearing in the debugger to let us know what this is actually going to do. So I'm just going to put something simple like check site. If you're working on a specific project, you might want to change that to something a bit more meaningful. And I'm going to set this to a Chrome instance, Chrome debugger. And we fill in a property called request, which we'll set to launch, because we're actually going to be launching a new browser tab to complete our debugging in. Another thing we need to supply is the URL of where we're going to be launching to. So you can see here this URL that I'm currently using. It's actually generated from the VS Code live server extension. So I'm just going to pop that in here. That's the URL that we want to launch to. And then we also specify the web root. And for that, we just use a special interpolated string, which is workspace folder. So this is just something that VS Code will understand and make sure that the files that it's launching within the debugger are going to match our current project. So if we save that now and head back over to our debugger, you can see that the window's changed a little bit. We don't have the option to create a configuration file because we've already done that, but you can see in this drop-down list here that we've got the ability to run our check site configuration, which is what we just configured over here. So if I actually click that button now, what will actually happen is it'll open up a new Chrome tab. So I'm just going to drag that over from where it's created it to so you can see it, and let's just make it fit over the other one. Okay, so this is the debugged version of our code that's actually in our project at the moment. So if I actually click the button again, what should happen is where I created that breakpoint within VS Code, it's taken me directly to the source file, and it should have actually paused the execution of the code in Chrome as well. So if I actually just have a look in here, you can see that on the console, it hasn't actually logged out the console.log yet, because that's where we've paused in our code. So this works pretty much the same way as the debug tools that are inside of Chrome. For example, we can hover over a particular variable name, and it should actually tell us the value. You can see there it's saying that I is 1, and we can also put that as a watched expression in here too. and also inside of our function and also of the global scope as well. So we've got the ability to step through our code as well as you would do with the debugger in Chrome. So we can go to the next line, for example, and we should find that console.log has now been output to the console here. So you can see 1 is being displayed. And of course, we can jump to the next breakpoint as well. So if we just press play to resume, there's no more code to run because the event listener has finished. But if we press click me again, now we can see that I has been updated to the value of 2. Okay, so that's a simple way that you can use the debugger in VS Code and launch an existing application that's already running and examine the code and the values that are stored inside certain variables. But let's actually stop the debugger now. And you can see the window that was running that debugged instance is now closed because that session has now finished. So there is another way that you can actually launch the Chrome debugger, and that's to attach to an existing session. So to do that, we need to create another configuration. So we'll head back over to our launch.json, and in our configurations array we'll create a new object, and this time the name we'll say is attached to Chrome, and this time we're going to set a port, and the port I'm going to use is 9222. We still need to specify the same URL that the Chrome's going to be attached to, so we'll just say the URL there is equal to our existing app that's running. This time though the request is going to be of type attach. But we still want to set the type to be Chrome. And also we'll set the web root again. And again, that's going to be to our workspace folder. Okay, so this will actually attach to an existing instance of Chrome, but it'll only attach to Chrome if the Chrome has been started in debugging mode with this particular port number. So to do that, we can actually start Chrome from the terminal with the optional remote debugging port. And on a Mac, we'll go somewhere like Applications, Google Chrome, and then inside of contents there's Mac OS, and then the actual Google Chrome instance itself, and then we set the remote debugging port equal to 9222. So we make sure that this matches with the port that we set here in the configuration. Now, just before I open Chrome again in this debugging mode, you actually need to make sure that all other instances of Chrome are actually closed down, because this won't work. If I run it as it is now, you'll see it should appear to open a new Chrome tab here, but we don't get any actual information about our debugging session, and we should actually get some information about that down here. So let me just close that down, and this time we're going to actually close down the existing Chrome window that we've got open. So if we try that again, running Chrome in remote debugging mode, but with all instances of Chrome closed down, we should see a slightly different message come up here, and we can see that it's saying that our dev tools are now listening on that particular remote port. And of course we get our instance of Chrome. So if we actually now browse to this URL again, so the live server URL, I think it should be still running. Yeah, so we've got our application back up again, and we're getting some information coming through here in the terminal too. Now if we actually go back to our debugger, instead of running check site this time, if we click the attach to Chrome option in our dropdown and then just click play, we should find now that VS Code is actually attached to our Chrome instance. And if we've still got our breakpoints created here in the index.js file, when we click the button, you can see the code breaks again, and we've got all of our watched expressions, and we can do exactly the same thing as before. The only difference now is that the new window isn't opened as it was before when we were clicking the launch debug option, rather than just attaching directly to our Chrome instance. It's up to you which one you use. I think it's a bit of a hassle trying to get a debugged Chrome instance running, so it's probably easier just to use the launch options and just getting a new window each time, but it's totally up to you. I'm going to actually close this now and actually just use launches for the rest of the tutorial. And that's our simple example over with. We're actually going to now start to look at a more complicated example, because there's nothing wrong with what we've done so far, but it's very unlikely that you're just going to have a single index.js file that's being loaded into a HTML file like this. You might have some build tools like Webpack or Parcel, for example, that's actually parsing your JavaScript files and actually putting it into a bundle. So that's what we're going to look at next. So let me just get rid of the changes that we've got here. I'm just going to move over to another branch that we've got. So we've got this complex example here. So our code now is slightly different. We've still got our index.js file, but we've actually got an ES6 module here from clicker.js, which is pretty much doing the same thing as we had before. We've just got a function to increment a value of I. and we're just importing that here and then just adding it to the button that's going to be created. So we can't just run our index.html file like this. It actually needs to compile this JavaScript for it to run in the browser. So we've got a compile script to do that, and that's being done by this command here with parcel. So I'm just going to serve our application here. So I'm just going to use npm run serve. And when that's built, we'll just open up the URL. So we've got a copy of that in Chrome. And again, we've got a similar application that we had before. In fact, it'll look probably identical to what we had before, but obviously the code is slightly different behind it. So we can actually click that button and log numbers to the console. Okay, so what we need to do here, say we want to actually put a breakpoint on this increment here, like we did before. If we just click the breakpoint on line 9 here, and if we have a look at our launch.json, you can see I've added one extra thing in here, which is this source map overrides, which basically makes sure that the files that are inside VS Code are mapping to the bundle that's running in the browser. Because if we actually have a look here at the bundle code, instead of having index.js running in our actual browser here, we've got a source bundle, which is all of the compiled parcel code that you can see here. Okay, so if we just actually launch the debugger again in VS Code, this time I'm going to use the check site, the launch functionality here. So this will actually launch a new window for us. Oh, I think I've got a breakpoint here from our existing index.js. So let's just remove that and just restart it again. Let's just move that over here. Okay, let's go back to the clicker.js class, and we've got the breakpoint set there. So if we click the button here, you can see again we're pausing in the debugger, and we've got all of the options that we had before. I does not exist though, this time it's this.I if we wanted to watch that in here. And again, we can use all of the debugging tools as we did in the first example. So just to show you why we needed that extra bit of configuration in the launch.json, if I was actually going to delete that here from the launch configuration for our check site config, if I try that again, and that will just open up a new window again for me. This time, if we actually go back to the breakpoint in clicker.js and then click the click me button again, you can see we've got this black circle here for the breakpoint. And if we actually click the button again, you'll see that actually logs out to the console and is not pausing the execution within VS Code. And you see if you hover over the breakpoint, it says it's unbound, which basically means it isn't part of this debugging session. And that's because we need those source mappings in to actually make sure that the code is mapped correctly from VS Code into the browser. So just to demonstrate that again, if we go back to the launch.json and add that code back in, if we click launch again from the debugger for check site, move that over here. If we go into the clicker.js file again, you can see the breakpoint is now red because it's good, it's active in this session. And of course, when we click the button, we pause execution directly here in Visual Studio Code. So that's all you really need to know for these complex examples. When you are using some build tool, it could be Webpack or in this case Parcel, and it's compiling all of the files, you just need that source mappings attribute in your launch.json to make sure that this works. So let's have a look at how this would work with a React app. And in all fairness, we don't really need to do anything else to our configuration here. We just go to this branch here, React example, to load a React app. And we'll just restart Parcel because I think it's had some problems finding some files there. And let's have a look at our React application while that's going on. So it's really simple. It's all in this one index.js file, although if it was split into different files, then obviously it would import those and compile those for us. But essentially what we're doing here is we're actually importing React and React DOM to actually initialize our app. And again, that's something that you couldn't really easily do inside of just loading a file in an index.html file. So we need a build tool to do that for us. And again, if we look at the launch.json, you can see we've got the source mapping in there as well, so that we'll have this mapping between the bundle that Parcel creates for our React app and also the source code. So what we could do here this time is we could put a breakpoint on line 9 to check the value of counter. Let's just refresh the page now. So we've got an instance. So it's a similar thing as we had before, except we're just using some React data binding to actually put the value of counter on the page. So you go, you can increment that just by clicking the button. Okay, so let's launch our debug session from check site. And if we just move that over here, You can see the execution is paused straight away because this data binding is looking to be run before we render anything to the browser. And if we hover over counter, we should see its value that's stored in there. So currently it's 0 because we've used the useState hook to initialize it as 0. And of course we can watch that in here as well. So we'll just say counter. And let's put a breakpoint here now on the line for on click so that we can capture those click events. So I'm just going to remove that breakpoint there and just resume execution. Okay, so now when I click the button, we should find that our code is paused inside of Visual Studio Code. And again, we can examine all of these values that are inside of there, such as counter. And if you wanted, you could dig deep into the actual code that's running as well. So here I've actually dug into part of the React code. This creates element with validation, and I can examine that function and have a play around with what's going on there if I need to. And of course, if I resume the debugger as well, the rest of the application carries on and our counter gets incremented, and the VS Code debugging session releases the app to carry on. So obviously this is just a really simple React component and just seeing how that might look. But hopefully you can get the feel of how you can set up your debugging sessions, put in your breakpoints, and then dig into what's going wrong in examining certain values if you're getting some strange results. And hopefully throughout this tutorial you've seen how it's been really useful to actually put the breakpoints inside of our source files in VS Code and not worry about having to dig around in the browser trying to find out where the files are and manually setting the breakpoints in there. So thanks very much for watching. That's the end of this tutorial. Hopefully you found it useful. Just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and so you don't miss out on any future tutorials. And I'll see you next time.